Today we're going to talk about ways to join your granny squares together, and in this video I'm going to share 7 different methods to join granny squares together. Joining granny squares can be a bit of a painful task, I gotta be honest. It's so fun working on the granny squares themselves, and there's lots of great projects like blankets and cardigans that look so beautiful made from granny squares, and we get excited, we make all our granny squares, and then it comes time to assemble our project, and I gotta be honest, it is not my favorite part. One of the reasons I'm not a fan is because sometimes it can take a while to join the squares together. But it can also be frustrating if I'm not sure how exactly I want to join the squares together. So hopefully as you look through these 7 ideas, you will find inspiration and be able to figure out which join method you want to use for assembling your granny square projects. So I have 2 different colored squares here and a different color of yarn for joining together, just so that way it's easy to see on camera. But of course you can join your squares with the color that matches. So the first method is what's called the whip stitch. And specifically we're going to do a whip stitch going through both loops. What does that mean? I'll show you in just a moment. The tool we need for this process is a tapestry needle. And I personally really like the metal ones over the plastic ones, but a plastic one would work just as well. So I'm going to start by threading my needle. And if I were going to be leaving these sewn together this way, I would cut off a tail that's about 2.5 times the distance that I want to sew together. But for this video, I'm just going to leave it attached to my ball of yarn since we're going to keep connecting these same 2 squares over and over again. So the way I like to do the whip stitch is I like to take my projects and put their backs against each other. So this is the front side of this square, this is the front side of this square. I'm going to put it so the front sides of the granny square are on the outside. In this case, we're going to just join together along this edge here. We're not going to go all the way around. So I'm going to hold them together like this, and on the granny square closest to me, I'm going to find the chain 1 that I did in the corner, so the very corner of the square, and I'm going to go through that chain 1 going away from me. Then we've got this other granny square, and I'm going to find the corresponding chain 1 in the corner. So if we kind of flip it over and look from this way, this stitch right here is the chain 1. So flipping it back over, that's the chain 1, and I'm going to go through that chain space in the same direction. So again, pointing away from me. And then I will pull my slack on through. And I'm just pulling enough through so I have enough length to go all the way along this side. If I were detaching from the ball of yarn and was going to leave this permanently sewed together, I would cut the tail end here and I would tie this on. And you can tie it off however you want, just you can knot the ends together, whatever you want to do to fasten that end off. But now to continue the whip stitch, I'm going to go to the next stitch on my front square, and I'm going to go through the top of that stitch in the same direction, so we're always going away from ourselves. I'm going to look at the back granny square and find the next stitch and go through that one as well, again going away from myself, and then pull my slack on through. And that'll create this little loop along the edge there. And I'm just going to do this all the way down where I go to the top of my next stitch on the front square, top of my next stitch on the back square, always working in the same direction. So in this case, I'm always going away from me. And try not to get it all tangled up as you pull it through, but once we pull it through, it's going to look something like that. And I'll just do this in the top of every stitch until I get all the way to the opposite corner. So at this point, I've gone from corner to corner and whip stitched through the tops of all the stitches. It'll look a little something like this. And then if we open it up, that's how the end result will be. Now, one thing I want to mention is with this join, and really with any of these joins, is you don't want to pull too tight because granny squares are going to naturally have some stretch to them. And we want our joints to have the same amount of stretch. So you can tighten it up a little bit, but if I pull my whip stitches really tight, the granny square can stretch this far, but my seam can only stretch this far. So that is something to keep in mind, that you leave a little bit of slack in your stitches so that way your joins will have the same amount of stretch as the rest of the project. But that is how to whip stitch through both loops, and this is what it looks like. The second way to join granny squares is very similar to the first, and this is going to be using the whip stitch, but only going through the back loops, or you could consider it the inner loops. Once more, I'm going to use a needle for this process, and I'm going to put my granny squares together so that way the right sides are facing out and the back sides are against each other. So the idea here is we once more start in the chain space at the corner, but instead of going through both loops in the top like we did last time, we're only going to go through this innermost loop. So if we look from the top here, we have 4 loops. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those 4 strands there, 2 in yellow and 2 in blue. We're not going to go through the outermost ones. So we're not going through this loop, not going through these loops, but we're going to go through just those 2 there in the middle. So if I come to my chain space here in the corner, I'm going to go through the back loop of that chain space, again going away from myself, and I'm going through just the back loop, not coming under that front loop. Then on my second granny square, this right here is the chain, and I'm going to go through just the back loop, but because it's kind of turned around, it's really like this inner loop. So if we were looking at it from this way, it's the back loop, but going under just the one loop, and then pull my slack on through. I'll go to my next stitches, and I'm going to go under just the inner loop of each granny square. Like so, and again, I'm always sending the needle in the same direction away from me. It'll again look really similar with those kind of crisscrosses, but these outer loops will remain free. Going to my next stitches, I'm going to go into the back loop and under these inner loops here, just under those 2 loops, and pull my slack on through. Once more, go through just the inner loops, not through all 4 loops. Pull my slack on through, and I'll work this all the way down to the corner. At this point, I've worked all the way along the edge from corner to corner. Again, I made sure to leave enough slack in my join, so that way the join will have just as much stretch as the rest of the granny squares. And now when I open it up, it'll look a little something like this. And this is one of my favorite ways to join granny squares because I like how we still see those front loops. I think it just creates a really nice, clean, and interesting join. And of course, if you're using a color of yarn that matches with your squares, it blends in a lot better than the pink does. But again, the pink kind of shows you where that join goes. For our third join method, we're going to slip stitch through both loops. And to do this, we'll need a crochet hook. Now, I do recommend at the very least using the same size hook that you use to make your squares. And I would even possibly recommend going up a hook size if you tend to do your slip stitches very tightly. I personally do my slip stitches very tightly. And what that does is it can create a really tight join that has no stretch. And again, these granny squares and the rest of the fabric is going to have some stretch, so we want the stretch of our joins to kind of match it. So if you find that you have really tight granny squares, I would suggest either going up a hook size from the hook you use to make your squares, or else consciously try to do your slip stitches kind of loosely. So to work this, we're going to start by making a slip knot and putting that onto our hook. And then once more, we're going to stack our granny squares together where they're wrong sides together. So what I like about this join is it goes a little faster because you don't have a long tail that you're pulling through all the loops. You just have a working tail off to the left, much like when we normally crochet. So this is working through both loops. Again, we're starting in the chain space of the corner. So I'm going to insert my hook through the chain on the front granny square, insert my hook through the chain stitch on the back granny square, and then I'm going to yarn over and pull through everything to make that slip stitch. Then go to my next stitches, so go through the square in the front, through the square on the back, yarn over and pull through everything to work that slip stitch. Again, go through the front square with my hook, go through the back square with my hook, work a slip stitch. And I'm consciously trying to keep a bit of looseness in this because I do tend to do my slip stitches really tightly. And I'm just going to work a slip stitch in the tops of each stitch of the granny squares, working my way down to the corner. So I've made it down to the corner, and then we can open it up, and this is what it will look like. Now this does tend to create a bit more of a ridge at your joins, and you will see your slip stitches on either side. Again, if you use a matching color, it's not quite as noticeable, but if your granny squares that you're joining are different colors, and let's say I use yellow for the join, you would be seeing some yellow on this side, or if I use some blue, you would notice the blue on this side. So just throwing that out there. Now this is one of those joins that I really like for projects that are laying flat, so maybe like a bag. If I were seaming up the sides of a bag, I would love to use this join. I think it's a great option. But when we open it But if we're opening it up for something, say like a blanket, you do get a bit more of a noticeable ridge, and for some projects I'm just not a fan of that, but don't worry, the fourth method will take care of that. So this next method is going to be similar, but the way we go about it's going to be just a little bit different, and this is going to be slip stitching in just the inner loops, which are those back loops. Now, what we have been doing so far is we've kind of been stacking their squares together. This time we're not going to do that. So what I'm going to do to work this is my square that's on the right, I'm going to go down through the inner loop of the corner. And then I'm going to go to my other square, go to the corner, and go down through the inner loop. And I've got a slip knot already on my hook of the yarn I'm using to attach these together. And then once I've gone down through both my squares, then I'll yarn over and work the slip stitch. Then I'll move on to the next stitch and I'll go down through just that inner loop on the right square, and then down through just the inner loop on the left square, yarn over and slip stitch. Go to my next stitch, going down through just that inner loop, down through just the inner loop, yarn over and slip stitch. And I'm going to work this all the way to the corner, and I'll show you how this one ends up. So once I work all the way to the other end, this is how this one turns out. And this lays much flatter than the other slip stitch version, and part of that's because we're going through just one loop, but the other reason is because we're kind of stacking those inner loops and then seaming them together versus folding them in half and then laying it open. And so it creates a really nice, pretty flat kind of seam here. Here's what it looks like from the underside. And this is another one of those joining methods that I really like just because I think it's so unique, and I just love the way the finished look turns out. The fifth method for joining granny squares is going to be a single crochet join, and we're going to go back to doing the thing where we kind of stack the granny squares together with the outsides facing out and the wrong sides together. And this is going to be really similar to that first slip stitch method I showed, but instead of doing a slip stitch, we're going to do single crochet stitches. So again, I'm starting with a loop on my hook, just a slip knot here. And I'm going to go through both loops on the corner of my first panel, go through both loops in the corner of my second granny square, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two, and that's my first single crochet. Then go to the next stitch on this front granny square, go to the next stitch on the back granny square, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two. So this is pretty straightforward. We're just working single crochet and we're working through both squares at the same time and completing that single crochet stitch. I'll work this all the way to the corner and show you how it turns out. So I finished joining the two sides and then I can open it up. Now this one for sure creates a ridge, so if I were assembling granny squares into something like a cardigan or a blanket where I'm going to have more flat sections, I probably wouldn't use this kind of a joint unless I really wanted that intense ridge and that intense texture. But instead this joint would be great for something like if I'm making a bag. Let's say I've already attached both panels for the bag, then I could use the single crochet method to join the outside edge of the bag. And it creates kind of this fun ridge, so like that would be like the bag opening, but you still have this fun little ridge all along the outside. But if you really wanted to, you of course could use this for flat things like blankets. Just note that you will have a pretty tall ridge sticking up from those stitches. For the sixth join in the video, we're going to be doing an invisible join, and I just want to really quick point out that this is a invisible join. I have seen some other invisible joins, but I'm going to show you the method that gives my favorite results, and hopefully you'll like it too. We'll need our needle again for this method, and I'm using this pink yarn again, but that's going to really show the beauty of this join method. So this method's going to be a little bit goofy, a little bit different at first, but with time this method should start to come a little more easily. So let's first look at the tops of our stitches. The tops of our stitches have this V kind of shape, and it's because this loop got pulled through this loop, and this V is a loop that got pulled through this loop, which is this V, which got pulled through that loop, and so on and so forth. So if I spread the base of the V apart, we can see the loop from the V stitch right before it. So that little piece right there is part of this V right there. So it's just one big loop going through there. And this is what we're going to be stitching under. This is what we're going to find as we work on this project. So I'm going to start with my left granny square, and I'm going to find that chain one in the corner, and it's this right here. Once I find the chain, I'm going to go back one stitch, and this is for the left corner that we're joining. So this is the chain, and I'm going to go back one V shape, and I'm going to find the front loop of this V right here, and it's going to be at the base of the V of the chain. So I'm looking for this piece right here, and that piece is part of the loop right before the chain stitch. And I'm going to insert my needle onto that loop, going in the direction of the side. Okay, so my phone rang there, so the video might be a little choppy, but basically I'm now just pulling through the slack so I have enough to seam the whole length of the side. Now I'm going to go to my right granny square. And once more, I'm going to find that chain one that creates the corner. And it's this space right here. So on the right granny square, I'm going to look at the V that makes the chain corner, and I'm going to go to that loop at the front of it. So it's going to be right between the sides of the next chain, under that loop right there. And again, I'm working my needle in the same direction, and then pull it on through. Then I'm going to go back to my left granny square. We just went under right there, so now I'm going to go to the next stitch and go under that same part of the loop, but under the next stitch. Again, working in that direction. And pull my slack on through and try not to tangle it up. I'm going to leave this a little loose for a moment, but then we'll take out the slack as we go along. Go back to my right square. So we just went underneath here, so now we're going to go to the next spot, the next stitch, and go under that front of that loop. So kind of between the base of the V shape at the top of a stitch. Go back to my left square here, and I think it's a little easier to see on the left square here. But again, under that end loop of the V. So just going to the next spot. Right through there. And I'm going to keep working this down, kind of just going through the loop part of the top of the stitch. Work on the right one, then on the left one, then on the right one, then on the left one, and my needle's always going the same direction. And once I do a few of these, then I can tighten up and take out the slack, and that join's going to basically disappear. So let me work it all the way down to the end, and then I'll show you how this looks. So I made it down to the other corner, and I just wanted to show how I kind of work a few stitches and then pause and take the slack out. So I did the first few stitches, you saw me take the slack out on camera, then I worked the next set of stitches, then took the slack out, I worked my final set, and I'm just going to pull once more to take the slack out. And as you can see, it's a near seamless join from the back and from the front. Now I've got to be honest, this one can be very tedious to work on, and it's easy for the stitches to end up a little bit off and not get nice and lined up properly. But it is such a beautiful seamless join. We used a totally different color, and you really don't see it peeking through except in a couple spots where I might have gone through the wrong spot with my needle. But it hides that join really well. So this is one of those joins for me. It's not like it's my go-to method like I always do this simply because it takes so much effort, but it is a handy one to have in my little bag of tricks to be able to use this when I want to have a nice flat and invisible join. So now we come to our 7th and final join, and I'm going to call this one the mesh join or the lattice join, and you'll see why I call it that in a moment. Now, as a fair warning, I do want to mention that this is probably the most complicated join, but don't let that scare you. It's absolutely worth learning, and I think it creates a really neat effect. I use the same technique in my Not Your Granny's headband crochet pattern. I'll link to that video. But it's a really fun way to join granny squares, so let's get into it. We're once more going to be using a crochet hook for this join, and I've started by putting a slip knot onto my hook. So I'm going to start with my left granny square here, and I'm going to insert my hook from top to bottom through the chain one space in the corner. Then I'm going to yarn over and pull through everything to join my yarn with the slip stitch. So now here's how this pattern works. We're going to start by chaining 3, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to make our first connection to our next square. So I'm going to go to the corresponding corner of that square, and I'm going to insert my hook again top down, so kind of from the front side down to the back. And once my hook is inserted under there, I'm going to yarn over and then pull that yarn through everything to slip stitch, and that's going to be our first connection point. Now we're going to start making these little crisscross shapes, and it's going to look a little goofy. The steps are a bit unconventional, but don't be scared. Give it a try. Once you follow through the steps, you'll see that it's actually not too bad. It just takes a little practice to get the hang of. So we're going to start by chaining 2. 1 and 2. Then I'm going to yarn over and insert my hook in this corner. So the same spot where I joined on this first granny square. I'm going to insert my hook in that spot, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. So now I've got 2 loops on the hook, and we're going to pause there. Now we're going to yarn over, and we're going to go to our next connection point, and that's going to be on the other side of this 3 double crochet block. I'm going to go in this space right here with my hook, again from top to bottom, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. So now I'll have 3 loops on my hook, and I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3. It's going to look a little weird at first. That's okay, just hang in there. The last thing we need to do is we need to chain 2, 1 and 2, and then we're going to join in our second connection spot on our second granny square. So we're going to go not in the corner here, but we're going to go over to our next spot, which will be between the double crochet blocks. I'm going to insert my hook down through the granny square, through that spot from front to back, and then yarn over and pull through everything to slip stitch. And so essentially it creates this kind of little crisscross here. Now we're going to repeat the process. I'm going to start by chaining 2, 1 and 2, then I'm going to yarn over, and on my first granny square I'm going to go to the same spot where I did my last join. So it's going to be this spot right here where we already have a bit of a stitch worked in there. And I'm going to insert my hook through there, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. Then I'm going to yarn over again and go to my next connection spot. So that'll be between the next 2 blocks. Insert my hook through there, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. Now that I've got these 3 loops left on my hook, I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3. Then to finish it up, I'm going to chain 2. So 1, 2. Go to my other granny square, find my next connection point, which is going to be right here. Insert down through that spot, yarn over and pull through everything to work a slip stitch. So you can start to see this lattice pattern or this mesh pattern forming. So let me show you one more time. I'm going to chain 2, 1, 2, yarn over, and insert through the same connection spot that I inserted in the last time on this first square. So go through there, yarn over and pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. Then I'm going to yarn over, go to my next connection spot, which will be in the corner, insert through there, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2. And then lastly, I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 3 loops. Then to finish it off, I'm going to chain 1 and then 2. Go to the next join spot on my second granny square, which in this case is going to be the corner. Insert from the top down, yarn over, pull through everything to slip stitch. So that's how you work that little crisscross pattern all the way across. Now in the beginning we did have this chain 3 kind of creating a flat edge. So what I like to do is when I get to the far side, I like to work a treble because it kind of balances out the chain 3 from the starting edge. So I just pop a treble in to this corner. So yarn over twice, insert my hook, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. And so you get this fun mesh or lattice-like join where you have these crisscrosses, and then we just have kind of a straight spot along the edge. So those are 7 ways that you can join granny squares. The last thing I want to mention before I wrap up the video is kind of how we join granny squares once we've already made some connections. So here's what I mean. Let's say you're making a blanket and you have a bunch of granny squares. If it were me, what I would do is I would first join long rows of granny squares. So I would join this granny square to this granny square, and then join my next granny square right along here, and so on and so forth. So essentially I'd end up with a long line of granny squares. I would make all my long lines of granny squares, and then I would do my join to join the long strips of granny squares. And when we get to the join spot, how you treat it will kind of depend on which join method you went with. In some join methods, the corners of these two will actually meet together. So in that case, you would treat both corners as just one spot when you're joining the long strips. In other cases, like this one, we have some width to our join. So in this case, I would treat each of these as a unique spot simply because the join keeps them separated. Not sure if that makes sense, hopefully it does, but my point is that you might need to make some adjustments when you join on your next granny squares to make a 3D shape versus just joining end to end. But hopefully this video was helpful. I hope you enjoy these ideas. Let me know in the comments which join method is your favorite, or if there's a join method that I didn't mention in this video that you really like, share it in the comments below so that we can all learn new ideas. But thanks so much for watching and happy crafting!